Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-mursaleen, Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Welcome to the Civilization and Society program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the third of 12 sessions which make up the Politics of Power module. The entire session will last approximately 1 hour and comprise a lecture of around 40 minutes, followed by a 5-minute interval and ending with a short question and answer period. You're encouraged to make a written note of any questions that may occur to you in the interest of clarity and ease of delivery. So this is the first of 4 consecutive lectures focusing specifically on the matter of the French Revolution. The purpose of this session is to build a solid platform from which to embark upon this journey by providing a clear exposition of the key events and the circumstances in which they occur, beginning with the accession of Louis XVI, who reigned from 1774 to 1792, but with particular emphasis on the defining period from 1788 to 1799. We'll also aim to become familiar with the common terminology relating to the revolutionary period. With regard to the French Revolution, fewer events have attracted more speculation, analysis, interpretation, and ongoing historiographical outpourings on the part of professional historians and social scientists. This can hardly be surprising given its seminal importance as the source and crucible for the central political, social and ideological modalities and institutions of modern Western civilization, including, it has been argued, the initiation of the practice of total war during the Revolutionary War of 1792 to 1815. Norman Davies states the matter as follows. There is a universal quality about the French Revolution which does not pertain to any of Europe's many other convulsions. Indeed, this was the event which gave the word revolution its full modern meaning. That is, no mere political upheaval, but the complete overthrow of a system of government together with its social, economic and cultural foundations. In 1789, there was reason to believe that changes were taking place which would affect people far beyond France and far beyond mere politics. Paris was the capital of a dominant power and the centre of an international culture. The revolutionaries had inherited the Enlightenment's belief in the universal abstraction of man. They felt that they were acting on behalf of people everywhere, pitting themselves against universal tyranny. Their most noble monument was not some parochial pronouncement on the rights of the French, but a ringing declaration on the rights of man. If that were possible, Ian Dallas makes the same point while placing even greater emphasis on the unprecedented depths of the revolution's radicalism. He says, "Here was a revolution without precursors. Even in the thinking of its exponents, it was consciously viewed as a new beginning in the history of mankind. It ripped apart the fabric of time. It declared its repudiation of tradition and the past. It claimed that for the first time society was being created on rational principles. They were starting from zero. 1789 saw the emergence of a unified set of beliefs, the limitless power of the will, the efficacy of reason, the indefinite capacity to mould reality. It was not utopian. Political will could change reality and reconstruct society. Given the enormous historical and ongoing impact that these developments have had upon the Muslim world, and the part they have played and continue to play in the domination, suppression, co-option or corruption of any new or emerging competitor, all the more reason, therefore, that we as Muslims living under this dispensation are obliged to understand the path of its ascendancy, the symptoms of its deterioration, and the indications of the new nomos. So I'll begin with a brief outline of the events and of the history, before turning to a more detailed chronology of the events. So we'll try to get an overall picture first of all. The generally accepted starting point of the French Revolution is the convocation in 1789 of the Estates General, which was a general assembly representing the three estates of the realm, respectively the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. That year saw the proclamation of the Tennis Court Oath, where representatives of the Third Estate pledged themselves to the establishment of a new constitution. There also occurred that year the assault on the Bastille and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The following 2 or 3 years were taken up with continued wrangling between the monarchy and the various tendencies until 1792, when the monarchy was abolished and the Republic declared. That year also saw the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars and the sensational rise of France's most successful general, Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed in 1793, and the uncontrollable wave of popular radicalism led by the Jacobins, who were the main political club associated with the leading figures of Danton and Robespierre, culminated in the tyranny of the Committee of Public Safety and the beginning of the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 94. The Jacobins decimated their own ranks in a frenzy of denunciations until finally Robespierre himself was executed in 1794. In 1795, power passed to the Directory, which is a new executive body which governed the French state until it was replaced by the Consulate under Napoleon in 1799. So that's just an overall picture, which I hope you're able to see, because now we're going to go into the chronology in more detail. And so this is the chronology of events from 1774 to 1799. 1774, on the death of his grandfather, Louis XV, who reigned from 1715 to 1774, Louis XVI succeeded to the throne of France and Navarre, aged 20. He had already been married for 4 years to Marie Antoinette, who was the Archduchess of Austria, and one of the many children of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa and the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. Beginning in this year, a succession of Louis's ministers of finance would eventually lead France into the national insolvency crisis, which instigated the king's fateful summoning of the Estates General in 1789 with a view to raising emergency revenues. The first of these appointments was Jacques Turgot, from 1774 to 1776, who was the scion of an old Norman family, a Latin scholar and economist, whose entry into the field began with a refutation of paper money. In the year 1776, Turgot proposes a raft of economic and financial reforms which aim to reinforce the position of the monarchy. However, under pressure from political infighting and the opposition of the Paris Parlement, which was a regional legislative and advisory council, the king dismisses Turgot. In the year 1777, Turgot was replaced in charge of the Exchequer for the first of two separate tenures as Contrôleur Général. In 1776 to 81 was his first tenure, and 1788 to 9 was his second tenure, and this was by the Protestant Swiss banker Jacques Necker. And he managed to secure huge loans as well as take proper charge of the royal accounts. The next year, 1778, France declared war on Britain during the American War of Independence, which lasted from 1775 to 1783, sending aid and assistance to the rebellious colonies, which would shortly thereafter become the United States of America. However, this outlay was instrumental in precipitating the financial crisis. In 1781, the publication of Necker's Compte Rendu, which is a statement of accounts of the Royal Treasury, gave rise to court infighting and opposition, which resulted in his dismissal. In 1783, Alexandre de Calonne, an aristocratic statesman of proven political acumen and commercial ability, was appointed as the new Contrôleur Général from 1783 to 1787. He set about the task of raising revenues with energy and imagination, even recoining the gold coinage, but all to little avail. In 1786, after making the king aware of the parlous state of the royal treasury, he proposed a number of reforming financial measures which included the elimination of certain fiscal advantages of the privileged classes, those being the first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility. In 1787, the Assembly of Notables, which was a body hand-picked by Calonne and consisting almost entirely of aristocrats, rejected his proposals. Calonne then was dismissed by Louis and forced to leave France for Britain. The chief minister, Archbishop Loménie de la Brienne, from 1787 to 88, was called into the breach. The Assembly of Notables was discontinued, and the Paris Parlement was exiled to the provinces for refusing to ratify new taxation. In response, Louis resorted to the lit de justice, which is an old procedural device for enforcing royal decrees in order to insist on a new 5-year loan. In 1788, the Parlement of Paris, still in exile, called for the abolition of lettres de cachet, and these were sealed orders from the monarch by which someone could be sentenced to imprisonment without trial, without opportunity for defense, or any possibility of appeal. And convocation of the Estates General. So this was the demand of the Paris Parlement. They wanted these lettres de cachet to be abolished, and they also wanted a convocation of the Estates General. In the meantime, the estates of the Dauphiné, which is another area of the country, They met illegally as an act of autonomous defiance of royal authority. The repercussions resulted in the resignation of Brienne, which opened the way for the appointment of Necker to tackle the financial crisis. So this was the second appointment of Necker. To popular acclaim, the Parlement was permitted to return to the capital, but this welcome quickly evaporated when it insisted on the estates meeting and voting separately rather than as one body. This year also saw a disastrous harvest and constantly rising food prices. So a key year then, 1789. At the end of April, the Réveillon riots took place in Paris when, against a backdrop of cold, hunger and unemployment amongst the city's poor, the eponymous industrialist stated publicly that his workers could easily manage on half the meagre daily sum he paid them. His house was surrounded, buildings were demolished, and soldiers were called in and ended up opening fire, leaving over 300 dead. On the 4th of May, which was less than a week after that event, the Estates General convened at Versailles. The delegates ignored the official agenda. The Third Estate wanted the three orders to vote as one, and there was little opposition to this from the clergy and nobility. On the 17th of June, the Third Estate made the illegal but decisive move, declaring itself as the National Assembly. 3 days later, on the 20th of June, occurred the event which is taken as marking the beginning of the revolution. Having been locked out of their usual venue, the deputies met instead on the nearby tennis court and swore the famous tennis court oath, never to desist until France had a constitution. The resulting developments were chaotic. On the 23rd of June, at the royal session at Versailles, Louis XVI offered various concessions, but refused to recognize the National Assembly. But by the 27th of June, Louis yielded and directed the clergy and the nobles to unite with the Third Estate. On the 11th of July, Necker was dismissed and replaced by Louis-Auguste de Breteuil, a conservative aristocrat who turned out to be the last chief minister of the Bourbon monarchy. On the 13th of July, marauding gangs roamed the city in search of arms. A committee of public safety was instituted, and a National Guard consisting of 48,000 men formed under General Lafayette. The next day, the 14th of July, the rioters seized 30,000 muskets and cannon from stores at Les Invalides, which was a fortress in Paris, and these arms were used later in the day during the iconic storming of the Bastille and the brief conflict which ended with the death of the governor of the royal fortress. At this point, it was clear that Louis had lost his hold on Paris. On the 17th of July, we were still in the year 1789, as a last attempt to keep his grip, the king drove from Versailles to Paris, openly wearing the revolutionary tricolor cockade. From now on, the great fear begins to sweep across the countryside. Davies describes it as follows. In the provinces, news of the fall of the Bastille triggered an orgy of attacks on 40,000 other Bastilles. Castles and abbeys were burned. Noble families, indiscriminately attacked by hungry peasants, began to emigrate. Cities declared for self-rule. Brigandage proliferated. France was dividing into armed camps. It was the season of La Grande Peur, the Great Fear, a summer of unprecedented social hysteria fired by rumours of aristocratic plots and peasant atrocities across the country. On the 4th to 5th of August, 30 decrees are issued abolishing serfdom and all feudal privileges. On the 26th of August, in the presence and under the auspices of the Supreme Being, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was passed. Consisting of 17 articles, it preserved and developed elements contained in England's Bill of Rights of a century earlier, 1689, and the pronouncements pertaining to the independence of America. On the 5th to 6th of October, Louis XVI and the National Assembly were made to move from Versailles to the centre of Paris. The royal family resided in the Tuileries Paris until 1792. In November, church properties were nationalised. And it's interesting to note here that the assignats, the paper money that came into circulation from 1791 onwards, have their origins in the bonds issued for the purchase of former church lands. So the year now 1790. In June, the complete civil reconstitution of the clergy was enacted, and August saw the reform of the French legal system and the abolition of the Parlement. In the year 1791, on the 20th of June, dressed as servants, while their servants dressed as nobles, the royal family attempt the flight to Varennes, and the king is arrested, and all are taken back to Paris under armed guard. So the king and his family are attempting to escape abroad in disguise. In August, Austria and Prussia issued a declaration, the Declaration of Pillnitz, demanding the release of the king with an implied threat of invasion, which in the end proved to be empty. In September, Louis accepted the new constitution and a new legislative assembly was elected, with all of the previous moderate leaders replaced by more radical anti-monarchist deputies. However, for 12 months, they failed to bring the situation under firm control. So we come to the year 1792. On the 20th of April, to the great satisfaction of the Assembly, Louis XVI declared war on Austria, which was now ruled by Marie Antoinette's nephew, Francis II, who was to marry his daughter, Marie-Louise, to Napoleon in 1810. On the 11th of July, in reaction to the manifesto of the Duke of Brunswick, who was the Austro-Prussian commander-in-chief, threatening to free the king and to execute the entire population of Paris if the palace was endangered, the Assembly proclaimed La Patrie en danger, or the fatherland in danger, and called for the outright abolition of the monarchy. On the 9th of August, the sans-culottes, who were the lower-class radicals and manpower behind the extreme Jacobin and Girondin factions, set up a revolutionary commune in Paris. The next day, on the 10th of August, led by the sans-culottes, the Tuileries Palace, which was the residence of the royal family, was stormed. The Swiss Guard were slaughtered, and the royal family shortly afterwards removed to the Temple, which functioned as a prison. On the 20th of September, the same day on which the French defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy, the first meeting of the National Convention occurred, taking over the reins of control from the Legislative Assembly. On the 21st of September, later to become day one of the revolutionary calendar, the Convention votes to abolish the monarchy and declares the establishment of a republic. On the 10th of December, charged with betrayal of the French nation, the trial of Louis XVI began before the Convention. Of course, what he was actually being accused of was being the king, as was the case 150 years earlier in England with Charles I. Davies usefully summarizes the revolution's rapid political progression from relative moderation vis-à-vis the monarchy and government in the following way. He says, if the Estates General and the National Assembly of 1789-91 were dominated by Mirabeau's constitutionalists, and the Legislative Assembly by the Republican Girondins, the National Convention took its orders from Robespierre's extremist Jacobins. So, just to summarize then, you have this progression in terms of the government of France from the National Assembly, which we saw, which was, as it says here, dominated by constitutionalists. In other words, politicians, statesmen who were still in favor of holding on to a monarchy, but limiting it in some constitutional way. By 1791, the National Convention had taken over, and the Legislative Assembly had taken over, and they were dominated by what they called Girondins, who was another of the main political clubs that formed in Paris, who were strictly Republicans. And by 1792, we'd moved on to the National Convention, which basically took its orders from Robespierre, and these were Jacobins of the extremist sort. So that's the progression. If we look now at the years 1793 to 95, from the beginning of this period, commencing with the purge and eventual execution of the core members of the hitherto leading Girondist faction of the Convention, under accusations of betraying the revolution, it could well and truly be said that the Jacobin reign of terror under Robespierre's direction was properly underway. The instrument of dictatorial power was the Committee of Public Safety, initially taken up by Georges Danton, and then subsequently taken over by Robespierre. However, we will see in subsequent lectures how the idea of the Reign of Terror as a specifically limited episode becomes misleading once the understanding of the entire revolutionary process as the very unfolding of terror as a political modality. On the 21st of January 1793, Louis XVI was publicly executed by guillotine, having been condemned to death for high treason by a majority vote of the Convention. Later that year, Queen Marie Antoinette was also tried, convicted of treason, and executed by guillotine on the 16th of October. In March 1793, the counter-revolutionary rising broke out in the Vendée. The merciless suppression of the Vendéens and others elsewhere in France, such as the Chouans, provide the most harrowing permanent evidence of the almost limitless bloodlust inflicted on the country at large at the peak of the terror in the Vendée alone, resulting in deaths estimated between 120,000 to 250,000. And it is said that for every victim of the terror in Paris, there were 10 in the Vendée. That takes us to year 1794. The following is a description of the infamous noyades, or drownings. In the spring of 1794, French Republican officers in Nantes had so many rebels from the Vendée to kill that they didn't know how to do it. They had unleashed the infernal columns. They had starved and massacred their captives, and they had been shooting batches of prisoners by the thousand, but it was not enough. They then hit on the idea of drowning. Nantes was an Atlantic slave port, and a fleet of large, shallow hulks was to hand. By sinking a loaded hulk, that is loaded with people, by sinking a loaded hulk in the river at night and then refloating it, they devised an efficient and inconspicuous system of reusable death chambers. These were the terrible noyades. Necessity proved the mother of invention in the technology of death. The notorious General Westermann is said to have sent the following report back to his political masters in the Convention. He says, "The Vendée is no more. I have buried it in the woods and marshes of Savonnet. According to your orders, I have trampled their children beneath our horses' feet. I have massacred their women, so they will no longer give birth to brigands. I do not have a single prisoner to reproach me. I have exterminated them all. The roads are sown with corpses. At Savonnet, the brigands are arriving all the time, claiming to surrender, and we are shooting them non-stop. Mercy is not a revolutionary sentiment." In April, Danton was denounced and sent to the guillotine for corruption and calling the severity and purposes of the terror into question. On the 28th of July, Robespierre, having been denounced for tyranny amongst other things, was guillotined without trial. In November 1995, after a period of 16 months' rule by the Thermidorians, who were those who had eliminated Robespierre, a 5-man executive called the Directory effectively took control of France for the next few years. In November 1799, Napoleon took control by coup d'etat, forming a 3-man consulate, which was confirmed by national plebiscite. And in May 1802, he appointed himself First Consul for life, and in May 1804 took the title of Emperor. That chronology then brings us to the end of today's lecture. The subject of our next lecture is the French Revolution Part 2, where we'll be taking a biographical look at the major figures of the revolution. For preparatory reading, I would recommend The Time of the Bedouin, Part 1, Section 2, which is on pages 45 to 92. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.
So, did Napoleon come to power through fighting for the cause of the Republic through more spirit of those people? Or was he a figure under the king also? Or did he just rise with the revolution? Or was he different?
So your question is whether or not Napoleon was a part of the whole process throughout the revolution. And rather than being something coming in from the outside. He was absolutely a part of the whole process, particularly with regards to the wars that were being fought by the revolutionary government within France. So he, as we noticed in the lecture, was clearly an incredibly successful general. And as such, anyone who is in charge successfully of the armed forces is a power to be reckoned with. And so the combination of Napoleon's success, which initially was something that would have been welcomed by the government of France, the revolutionary government, was of course a perfect vehicle for him as an individual eventually to take power into his own hands. Once the revolution started to fall apart.
Would you say the revolution created Napoleon? Without, if he was the king, he would have never got. It's almost like the sword was taken out because of the revolution subduing France.
So the question was then, was Napoleon a creation of the revolution? Now, this is something that we'll go on to look at subsequently, because what's important historically is to see, in a sense, what we've come out of your question echoes a particular approach to historical interpretation, which is almost mechanistic, and was the result of analysis based on the social sciences. In other words, the individual is not the main point. What the main thing is a series of circumstances, historical circumstances, which then produces the individuals and so on who take action. Our emphasis eventually is going to turn that on its head. We have to look at the individuals, see who they are, and see how they took hold of their opportunities, given their characters, given their circumstances, and so on, to their own advantage or disadvantage, as the case may be. So the short answer is Napoleon was Napoleon, and he was that kind of being, given the opportunities the revolution and so on, even before that, provided him with, because he had nothing, and he wasn't even French, remember. He was from Corsica, and Corsica was a backward. So he was a man of destiny, and fulfilled that destiny to the extent that I expect more books have been written about him than I don't know what comparison to make, but I mean, we never tire, historians never tire of looking at Napoleon. I don't know if that quite answers your question.
Yes.
There absolutely was. In fact, there always has been. Because the whole financial dynamic, which had been going on now for centuries, of monarchs having to raise money in order to pay for wars, and having to go to raise loans in order to do so, and the pressure to repay these loans was enormous. And so we end up, these are matters which dethrone kings and destroy national stability. And so it's quite clear, people understand the danger, or understood, and have always understood the danger of paying interest.
How many years before 1789? So, excuse me. How many years before 1789 were there elements of the idea of a revolution?
Okay, so how many years before 1789?
Which is classed as the new beginnings of the revolution. Were there elements of the idea of a revolution?
Now the idea. Okay, you're asking how long before 1789 had the idea of a revolution been on the boil? Now, the truth of the matter is, again, going back to this question of the interpretation of history through the social sciences, the idea of a revolution, in one sense, doesn't exist. Because, in a sense, this archetypal social disruption of the French Revolution was unique. It was unique. And that idea was so enormous in its extent and its totality that it's not really an idea outside of let's call them religious revolutions, let's say, which again are not ideas but are revelation, and people acting on revelation, and therefore turning things, yes, on their heads. But that's not really revolution in the sense that it becomes that it comes into being in 1789. So I would say that such an idea didn't exist. But if the question is how much dissatisfaction was there and how much unease was there with the abuses, let's say, of absolute monarchs and the oppression of feudalism and so on, then there's plenty of that. There's plenty of that. And as I think we looked at last week, when we looked briefly at Louis XIV as the archetypal absolute monarch, then the how much disruption and so on that gave rise to. So, yeah, the answer to your question really is that it's building up. That something is building up, and as we saw throughout the Reformation and so on, whereby people are looking for other ways to organize themselves, as a result of the the Reformation in particular, and all of those things we looked at with respect to people freeing themselves in the name of reason and so on.
I've got another question. We're talking about the three realms, the clergy, nobility, and the people. Who would you say the people were? Because I know you had peasants, would those be the people?
Okay, so you're referring to the three estates of the realm.
Yes.
The nobility, well, the clergy was the first estate, the nobility the second estate, and the third estate. You're asking who they were. The third estate were actually not just peasants and so on. They were everyone else, everyone who was not a noble or a clergy. So, in fact, in terms of political thinking and influence and involvement on the level of government, we had the third estate was packed with a mass of lawyers. So these were they were bourgeois, really. Of course, when it comes to numbers and muscle power and the cannon fodder and so on, then of course you're looking at the lower classes.
We reached last week the idea that you had tradition versus reason and modern thinking. And it seems to me that both parties were incomplete. And it seems to me, wouldn't it be great if the revolutionaries had looked into the best of what the traditional people had, and from what we know, the key being usury? Or wouldn't it have been great if the revolutionaries had managed to sit down with the old order and explain all their new thinking and included usury with that? It's as if both parties didn't really have the answer at all, but if they'd actually sat down at that point, they might have been able to get things right.
All right.
Although maybe that is still the task, inshallah, that needs to be done.
All right, so your question is that
Could they have done something?
yeah, could the traditionalists, as you've called them then, you've sat down with the radicals, let's call them, and tried to come to some proper exchange as to something that would work properly for everyone, so without throwing any babies out with the bathwater and so on. Now, again, apart from being hypothetical in that way, because one can then imagine all kinds of things, but what one sees is that fundamentally is the emergence as a force in its own right of ideology. And what ideology does is put the blinkers on in terms of the method of thinking and the vision of the outcome. And of course it requires belief and loyalty to whatever ideas are being taken up or seem to be in the fore politically. So it becomes, although if we go back to say, the Estates General, when they first meet, then you do have, people who, if you like, are fairly moderate and are trying to straddle the distance between, the extremist Republicans and the out-and-out traditional monarchists, and they're trying to come up with some kind of constitution, the English sort, if you like, that would limit the powers of the monarchy in such a way as to, hold on to the best of what monarchy might be able to bring to the situation. But all of the politics to do with the revolution itself, it's a revolution that is total. It wants to tear society apart and start again. That's what it wants. That's what it is fixed on doing. So any compromise with that was actually very dangerous. It was very dangerous for a great many of the leading figures, right down to Robespierre himself eventually. The idea of loyalty to the revolution and counter-revolutionary accusations and denunciations and so on is an unavoidable dynamic that makes it impossible, or that made it impossible for people to arrive at any form of compromise, even if that were the desire, and even if they had the insight and knowledge and political ability to bring that about under those circumstances.
What was Danton's connection to Dutch banking houses? Is that detailed in any history books?
Danton's connection to Dutch banking houses. I'm not sure why you pick on Danton in particular.
I think he was the main link. They might well all have been connected, but I think it's through his connections that, I don't know, I just heard that.
Well, Danton, let's remember how he ended up. So he ends up also being executed, being denounced, and he's denounced for corruption. He's accused of corruption and also for questioning the purposes of the terror, for wanting to limit its extremity. Now, his connection then with bankers and money in that way tend to be tied in with the accusations of corruption in terms of enriching himself personally. Now, as I say, next week, the idea is that we're looking at these figures, these main figures, specifically. And by then we may have the chance to see, to what extent these things are fabricated and to what extent his involvement, we know that his involvement with and connections that he made abroad, would have been with a view to looking for, ways of sustaining the political stability and so on. But these are dangerous times. So just having connections abroad would be enough to have you to lead to a denunciation, to have you being accused of treachery. Because there's always a fear. I mean, and it was very significant during the revolution. There's always a fear that there's going to be invasion in order to to crush the revolution from abroad. This was a fear when Brunswick made his manifesto claiming that he would that the people of Paris and so on should free the king. The threat being that if you don't free the king and leave them alone, we will invade. Now, as it turns out, that became a pretext for out-and-out oppression, during the time of the terror.
When you mentioned that the king tried to escape by going in disguise, presumably he was caught and then returned back.
Yes, and the king, they tried to, there's a famous occasion where they tried to escape the country and were arrested in a place called Varennes. And a little bit of the background to that was that the king at that time, in fact, wasn't that confident about other monarchs in Europe. You have to understand also that these people are all related to each other, but people have their own interests, and as in the case of the Prussians, they made certain noises but didn't follow through, and that this kind of thing would have been happening all the time. So he, rather than trying to rely on, other monarchs, he took the advice and help that was offered by one of his, I think he was a general of some sort, who had the means and to maybe get him and keep him safely somewhere until he could make a proper escape.